Welcome, everyone. My name is Ahmed. I am Palestinian living on this stolen land. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. We're meeting today on a ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 200 years ago, and its echoes still reverberate to our day. I am dialing in today from Camaragal country. Today, I'm having an exciting conversation with Jumana Bayeh and Randa Abdel-Fattah, two Arab Australian academics and researchers at Macquarie University, who have set out on this journey to uncover the history of art and culture of Muslim and Arabs in Australia, to bridge that knowledge gap, aiming to build an archive of Arab Australian history. I hope you'll find my conversation useful and productive. Okay, welcome everyone. Arabs and Muslims here in so-called Australia have a long and rich history of creativity and community engagement that manifests itself in many areas, including cultural, production, and political activism. That history can be noticed more easily nowadays than in the past due to the current prevalence of social media and the proliferation of books and art produced by Arab and Muslim Australian creatives. However, much of the historical records of the Arabs and Muslims' culture and political legacy in Australia are often less accessible and widely unknown. Jumana Bayeh and Randa Abdel-Fattah, two Arab Australian academics and researchers at Macquarie University, have set out on this journey to uncover this history and bridge the knowledge gap, aiming to build an archive of Arab Australian history. Bearing in mind that part of the reason why the history is not readily available is because it may have been intentionally hidden, especially around political engagement through art, culture, and literature. And so, as an integral part of this project, Randa and Jumana are determined to overturn the hidden and silenced Arab artistic, cultural, and political narratives and voices. This is because it is crucial to enforce the fact that Arabs and Muslims in Australia have every right to narrate their own history and stories through art, culture, and politics. And so this archive is mainly an effort to center Arab voices in Australia. This is important now more than ever because it comes at a critical juncture where suppression of Arab voices, as well as academic and political repression, are at record high in light of the ongoing crackdown on students' right to protest in solidarity for Palestine and Lebanon in university campuses. Incidentally, as two Arab women working on the university sector, Randa and Jumana themselves have first-hand experience of this kind of repression and silencing in their workplaces. I'm delighted to be joined today with Randa and Jumana. Randa is a future fellow at Macquarie University. Her research areas cover Islamophobia, race, Palestine, the war on terror, youth identities, and social movement activism. Randa is also a former lawyer and the multi-award winning author of 12 books for children and young adults. Jumana is associate professor at Macquarie University, the president of the Australasian Association for Literature, and deputy chair of Arab Theatre Studio. Her research sits at the intersection of post-colonial studies and Middle East studies, especially the Arab Middle East and its diaspora. Her main research interests include Arab diaspora literature and culture and the history of colonialism in the Arab world. Welcome, Randa and Jumana, and thanks for joining me to this conversation.
Thanks for having us, Ahmed.
Pleasure. I want to start with this a question for both of you, if I may. Why is this project important? I mean, what motivated you to build this archive, and also why now? Maybe I can start with you, Randa.
Sure. So thank you for having me, and I'll just pay my respects to the Darug people on whose land I'm talking to you from today, where I research and study and raise my children. So I'm very excited because this project didn't start with a collaboration with Jumana. That was sort of the cherry on top. So I want to walk back a little bit about how I got involved. So I finished a DECRA looking at young Arab and Muslim youth post 9/11, growing up in a post 9/11 world, comparing their experiences growing up to the experiences of non-Muslim, non-racialized youth in Sydney schools. And out of that research, I was struck by how much of the language that they were using in terms of activism and articulating their experiences and trying to interpret the world around them, how much of it was shared language, how much of it was language pulled from social media, from mainstream media, from film. And that kind of got me excited about thinking the way that, popular culture, the way that mainstream media, the way that, cultural production, all intersects with political language and political identities, and how we don't really have a chronicling of that work from the point of view of social movement activism in so-called Australia, in these marginalized, racialized communities. In particular, I wanted to look at how we can chronicle the kind of sort of intersectional, anti-racist, feminist, anti-war, radical activism that happens in the margins, in the community, across kitchen tables, deep within, deep within community. What kind of work has been done to get us to a point of the kind of politics we see now? I feel very strongly about not only honoring the work that we should pay homage to, that we lean into, that we build from, that we owe so much to in the kind of causes that we're involved in now. But it's also very important for our own movement to understand the continuities and the departures. Where have we come from in terms of our activism? What worked? What didn't work? What were people doing in the 70s and the 80s? What language were they using? What political claims were they making? What tensions were they experiencing? What intra-community disputes and tensions and lateral violence were they experiencing? There is so much that we can learn from if we start to trace this history. And I didn't want to do this in a way that was traditional. I didn't want to just go and pick up documentary archival material. I wanted to create a space where we can also build an oral history of this, to try and be a bit more dynamic, to tap into the voices that are often silenced, that are marginalized, that haven't been given a space to speak about all their experiences. What kind of solidarity work has been done as well? That was really important because I want to really look at that kind of radical work. And that's why it's so silenced and marginalized, because it's radical, it's threatening, it's subversive. And that work often happens amongst women. That's a very key feature of the kind of activism that I've been able to trace. My idea with this future fellowship was to create a physical exhibition, but also a digital archive, so that it would be something accessible, that it wouldn't just be something within the confines of the academy, but something that teachers and students and young people can dip into online. And it's not going to be a complete history, because that would be impossible, but something that can spark interest, that gives people something to work with, particularly like a pedagogical space for teachers and for students. If you're an Arab academic, you're constantly getting emails around the end of year 12, year 11, people's personal interest projects, and they want help on these topics, because there really isn't a lot online that they can lean into and tap. So that was something that, that's part of my project. And Jumana is at Macquarie, and we started talking, and Jumana was doing something that really had a lot of crossover with what I'm doing, but from a different lens, and she'll talk about that. And you know, that meant that we had, you know, an overlap that we can build on together and create this repository of cultural and political production. And as we say, that is a very, very blurry line anyway, because the cultural is political, the political is cultural.
Just a quick follow-up question, actually. When you say radical activism, what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so very much, it's such a good question. A lot of the activism that has been profiled, that gets a lot of coverage and attention, particularly in the academy. So there's a lot of, particularly in the War on Terror years, the most prominent War on Terror years, a lot of work has been done looking at you know, activism about civil right, no, sorry, civic identity around, but all within a liberal multicultural framework. And so the voices that have come from the margin have been excluded from that. The voices that critique liberal, you know, settler multicultural politics and demands and aspirations, the voices that very much define their activism and pivot from the central focusing point that this is happening on stolen land, on sovereign Indigenous land. And that is what defines that kind of activism. So it's a very different methodology, a very different vision of what you're trying to achieve. It's far more transnational, it's far more intersectional, and it is a refusal, really, a politics of refusal against mainstream activism. And I can talk about that because I used to be part of the mainstream activism in those, you know, early post-war 9/11 years. And so I feel that I have a very good insight into the seduction of that kind of politics. I have very little tolerance or sympathy for it now, you know, over 20 years later. I think that masks have been lifted on that. But it means that I kind of want to trace the antithesis to that kind of mainstream, you know, model minority politics, and really look at the extraordinary, courageous, subversive, fun work that's been done on the margins.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's strange how that word radical can give negative reflections, but it's actually, you know, it should be the normal way of activism, you know, challenging the current narratives in the mainstream media, in the mainstream activism, and so on and so forth. Jumana, why is this project important? I mean, what motivated you to do that, and why now?
Okay, so again, just like Randa, I'd like to pay my respects to elders. I'm speaking to you from Gadigal country. Both of our projects, and this archive is just one arm of both of our projects, are funded by the Australia Research Council. One of the motivations for me was, I want to say academic, but there's probably a better word for it. So I'm doing work on the broad Arab diaspora in the Anglophone speaking world. And most of the other countries I'm working across have forms of physical and digital repositories that document Arab American, Arab British history. The biggest one is in the United States. And there are several, actually, in America. There are several pockets where you can find these kinds of materials, the biggest being, I think, in the Smithsonian. There's also the Khair Allah Center at North Carolina State University. Anyway, I go to conferences in these places. I meet with academics there. And I quickly got a sense, very quickly, that we as a community of Arab people in Australia really don't exist to them in a way that's worth their while to take us seriously or to study us. So I thought, how am I going to rectify this? And this was one way. I wanted to build this archive of material to show our international community, scholarly or otherwise, that we have a history here. We have a strong history here, and it's it's not something that just sprung up in the last sort of, 5 or 10 years, that there's been people doing the work and paving the way forward for that. And I wanted to bed that down and make it an accessible, permanent, whatever permanent means these days, for future researchers as well, in case they're interested. Randa and I do get contacted by prospective high degree researchers, people that want to do a PhD, and they're looking at these things, but we don't have the primary materials easily available to them. So that was one big motivation. It was certainly the motivation that I put down in my application to the Australia Research Council, that I wanted to help internationalise this part of research, growing part of research in the world. I wanted to internationalise Australia and push it into it. The other reason why I wanted to do what motivated me has to do with showing our own community that we have stories, and stories that we can tell ourselves, so a form of self-representation. I wanted to document the history of that happening, and the way that we've spent time doing that. And when I mean by the way, I'm talking specifically here about collaborations, and this is something that Randa touched on. So I guess one of the key modes, so I've been looking at this material for a little bit longer than that, or I started my project a little bit before Randa in terms of looking at material. And one of the things I gleaned or noticed very, very quickly was the intensely collaborative nature of the artistic work taking place. And by this, I don't just mean that 2 or 3 people came together and they thought, in a very loose way, let's put some kind of art show on or something like that. From the ground up, these people, and there's a whole cast of characters here, have been working together from the beginning of the work all the way through its development to create sort of the end product, so to speak. And it was all executed collaboratively. So, often we think of the playwright, the author, as a solitary person. In this case, you don't have that kind of situation going on. For example, a work like And They Called Her Silence, which was a play that was performed, or a performance piece, in 1992, and it happened in Newtown, which is not far from me, where I am. The archivist, as I like to call her, our friend, Alisa Chidiak, she handed me these paper materials. She's been keeping all of this documentation that I've been going through. She handed me the paper materials from her filing cabinet. I think it was in a section, if I recall correctly, and I could be wrong, it was in a section under Ta'a Theatre Group, or Taka Theatre Group, Ta'a meaning window. So they created this theatre group. And what I found there, and I'm a person who studies literature, so you can imagine how excited I was, were copies and copies and copies of reworked drafts of the play script. And it was reworked and reworked after every time, I'm assuming after almost every time, the performers met to discuss what they wanted to do. So they'd rework the script intensely together each time. So I've got this this evolving, I guess, series of documents, this evolving play script in front of me. And it's very hard to say who the author was, because one person drafted, I guess, and then it was built on from there. And that's the method that I've seen sustained across a lot of the performance pieces, whether they're plays or exhibitions or other forms of, cultural production. And it's all, as Randa also said, all intensely political work that's responding to something, whether it's a particular crisis or whether it's an issue to do with, responding to something to do with feminism. There's an intense sort of political bent to what is going on here. And I want to say that this collaborative work, I'm still thinking through this, is a more woman-inspired way of doing things. We can argue the toss about that if you want, Ahmed, what that might mean. And then another layer of the collaboration, and Randa, of course, mentioned this, of course, is the deep recognition of this work being done on stolen land. The solidarity between First Nations and Arab cultural practitioners over the years has always been there, from what I can see. And it's built on this politics of displacement and being familiar with the idea of displacement, being aware that we, even, as for whatever reasons our families migrated here, we're still settlers, we're still working on stolen land. And it's also built on, I guess, a sense of transnational care and respect and love. So those are the reasons I wanted to document all of those things. I wanted to put it in a place where it doesn't get lost so other people can find that work. Those are sort of the mixed reasons that motivated me for this.
I couldn't help but noticing, I mean, in your trips to the US, you've noticed that we're kind of lagging behind, or we don't have that infrastructure here. Like, why do you think that is, that lack of interest all the way until now? Like, why hasn't anything like this been established already in Australia?
That's a really good question. I think the Arab diaspora in the United States obviously it's not that it's older necessarily, it's just that it was bigger very, very quickly. For whatever reason, again, I'm still trying to come up with a thesis as to why this happened. The Arab American community that settled in the United States very, very quickly developed its own print culture. So there were newspapers, magazines, journals, and all of this, a lot of this material is archived in the Smithsonian. And there's like a massive body of work. And it took, from what I understand of the American scene, it took just one woman, a woman called Alexia Naff, who decided that this material needed to be somehow gathered, pulled together, and it ended up being put in the Smithsonian, the material she gathered, and it's called the Naff collection for a reason, because she was driven to do this. And she also traveled around apparently she drove a little car, and she traveled around America interviewing the first, people that were either the children of the earliest migrants or the earliest migrants themselves, if they were still alive. And I've not been able to work out exactly why we haven't done the same here and yet. And I guess I guess it's the lack of the size of the community, which grew mainly, I think, in the 1970s here in an intense way, and the absence of, I guess, of a motivation to do it from within the community. I mean, my friend and historian Anne Mansour, Dr. Anne Mansour, we've talked about this a lot. She's got a great theory, and she thinks that the White Australia policy forced migrants that arrived to Australia, as opposed to those that arrived to America, very, very quickly and very, very intensely, to somehow, I don't think she uses the word assimilate, but to not, embrace, accept, keep practicing their Arabness in an obvious way. So that kind of fell away quite quickly. That would be her argument, but I haven't been able to find enough evidence to work with her to write that up as a cogent argument or a believable argument. So I think that I don't have a perfect answer, but those might answer the question.
But
Yes.
Jumana, sorry, but the in the US, was it like in your research, has it been academics or people in the academy that have driven the archival work, or has it been outside of the academy? So
Alexia Naff, to my knowledge, wasn't an academic, but yes, since then there is a community of academics that are very much interested in. I mean, initially it obviously starts as Middle Eastern studies, but then Middle Eastern studies has grown into Arab diaspora research or Middle East diaspora research. And yes, it has been driven by the academic community there, which again, they have a higher level of representation in the academy than we do here in Australia. I mean, the Australian academic scene is small. It's only getting smaller, and we are, in every sense of the word, a very, very much a minority.
We're a minority within a minority. So
yeah.
I think that has a lot to do with it, not having the academic capacity to be able to resource this and drive it and bring the PhD students in. It builds a cottage industry to be able to do that.
Yeah.
That marginalization of our voices in the academy over the years, and the ones who have been able to make it have tended to tended to build within that multicultural liberal settler kind of cottage industry and build there. But the decolonial work that this requires and a decolonial vision is already a minority within a minority.
So, for example, like just quickly, Professor Akram Khatir, who's the director of the Khairallah Center at North Carolina State University, has that kind of an industry set up in his center. And the reason why it's partly called the Khairallah Center is because Mr. Khairallah, very wealthy man, bequeathed the university, I mean, he's still alive, I shouldn't say bequeathed, gave the university a lot of money to set up this center. And that's why it's there. And the archival work that they're doing is something extraordinary. I got to go into the room where they're digitizing, what's involved, where they're storing the materials. It's quite amazing. And we don't have access to that level of funding just yet.
Hopefully we'll get to that point soon. It's such an important work. I mean, let's get into the details of your current research. I mean, you've been working on this for, I'm not really sure, a few months, a few years now. I mean, Randa, what have you found so far as part of your research that you really want to get out there to the public and build on? Like, is there any interesting stories? We talked about these cultural, artistic works might have been intentionally not let out or not being allowed to be in the mainstream. Like, what have you found so far?
Okay, it's so like there is so much. It's so like the work that that sort of the archive that we're unearthing is so exciting, so dynamic. There is so much there, and Jumana's constantly, reminding me that we can't possibly cover it all. So it's really difficult to say, what are the best passes. I thought I would share 4 things from what I've found so far. So the first thing that I wanted to share was, and I know this is going on radio, but this is a photograph of somebody called Eddie Zananiri, who was, I think, one of the earliest, it's a GUPS meeting, one of the earliest PLO representatives. And this is taken in 1975 at Macquarie University. This is a talk that he delivered, but that talk was shut down by Zionist infiltrators at the university. So security came because they started to advance towards the stage, caused massive commotion and disturbance, and security had to shut it down. I thought that was such a poignant accidental find by an academic at Macquarie. And these are the sorts of stories that connect the dots between the repression and the pressure and the conflation of Zionism and anti-Semitism that we saw in the 1970s on university campuses with what we're seeing now, which is basically all masks are off, and we are seeing unparalleled repression of Palestinian, voices and the anti-Palestinian racism completely on another level. Trying to therefore trace what's been happening in terms of activism on university campuses in the 70s and the 80s, the work that was done with unions, the pushback, the kind of repressive tactics, I think is really important for this moment to also, for those who joined the movement post-October 2023, to understand the historical genealogies, a lot of the words and threats and political language used to suppress our voices, and to understand that history. This all builds your movement. It builds your arsenal of responding to these tactics. It helps you shape the way that you advocate. So I think that that's really important. It also can provide some sense of, I wouldn't say comfort, but for people who are coming on board now, even students who have really been the most incredible cohort of activists and advocates across the world in terms of our movement, to also see that this is nothing new, that this repression is nothing new. How did people deal with it in the past? How did they address it? What did they do wrong? What did they do right? So there's a lot to learn from looking at the past. Another part of sort of what I've been able to trace is the Free Palestine newspapers, and there was in terms of Palestinian activism, there was this, for example, publication called Free Palestine, and it's actually part of the Ali Kazak collection that I think is at the National Library. So there are small pockets of these collections, which is a phenomenal read to go through these monthly publications, newspapers from 1979, and to see that they are saying almost the exact same thing as they're saying now. The headlines on Lebanon, the headlines on the massacres, the headlines on Labour politicians speaking from two sides of their mouth, the repression, the cancellation of visas, the pressure to deny visas of any Palestinian advocates coming into Australia. All the same, very much, I would say, like the same sorts of debates and pressures that we are experiencing now have this history, and it's documented. So I think, again, that is a pedagogical site. It is a site for activists to learn from. And it also exposes how our movement, what claims we have been making, what demands we have made, also to look at how those demands have shifted, in response to pressures. That I think is very illustrative as well. And another thing is then when you dig deep into, especially the work Jumana and I have done, the focus groups that we have ran with Arab, radical feminist activists, I was really interested in Jumana is in those quotidian everyday spaces of activism. What did you wear? Where did you plan and plot? What bookshops did you go to? Where did you smoke and what did you eat? Where did you pray? Where did you write and perform? Where did you do your drafting? All of that work is so revealing. And when you start running these interviews and you let these people just, it's not structured, it's a very semi-structured type of focus groups and interviews. The stories are incredible. And those continuities as well. So there were two stories I wanted to share. One of them very much speaks to what Jumana was saying about the very collaborative work that was done. And that comes very much from a space of the kind of cultural community development work that these activists were doing. So one of them was telling us about how she attended a meeting in the early 90s, a Palestine human rights community meeting, and they were sitting around the table and they were drawing on the whiteboard, a potential structure for that committee. And they had very much a hierarchical structure. So at the top, they had a box that had the committee and the decision makers. And then they had two boxes below with events and catering and all the grunt work. But there was no line that connected both. And so this activist was saying how there was that separation, that understanding that there are the decision makers in this committee, and then there are those who do the grunt work, and how foreign it was to her, who came from community cultural development, years of collective and collaborative work, to run an organization in that way. It ran counter to the values that she had, applied to her work. And she said, all these years later, interviewing her in 2024, she'll never forget the image of that whiteboard. I thought it was so instructive again about how people, did this work, how they imagined their role and their community, because a lot of the problems that we see about the way that work is done can show us that it's because of the organizational structure and the lack of collaborative work. And the last story, which I thought was just so poignant, was Alyssa Chidiak, who was in, which is one of the most phenomenal, Arab activist, community cultural development, community cultural workers. And she was in Palestine in 1995. And while she was there, she wrote a poem called Sabr. And, she references cactus and prickly pear in this poem. And she dedicated it to the occupied lands of Palestine and Lebanon. And that poem was published in a book called Waiting in Space, which was co-edited by Paula Arboud, another incredible feminist activist whose work we're profiling in the archive. It was published in 1999, and it was adapted for a performance at the Belvoir by Taka Theatre in a performance in 1996 called Writing with the Hip. And in that performance, they had received this amazing poem from Alyssa, and they basically improvised in that theatrical production to put a fax machine, 1996, on the stage. And as part of the performance, they would receive the poem on this fax machine. Now, the reason I'm a reason this story stood out for me was because at the time that this story was relayed to Jumana and I in the focus group, I had just heard about Samah Sabawi, a Palestinian playwright, writer, poet in Melbourne, who had been performing in another theatrical production called Gaza Family Diary. And this was at the La Mama Courthouse Theatre. And in that performance, the actors were reading out WhatsApp messages that she had received from her family during the ongoing genocide in Gaza, where her family is from. And I thought that was just a really poignant link between the way that poets and political actors here use the resources available to them, the connections, to always bring the voices of Palestine onto the stage and into their work here. So in 1996, it was a fax machine. In 2024, it was WhatsApp messages. And then the other beautiful part of that story is the poem is called Sabr. Samah Sabawi's book, published a month later, was called Cactus Pear for My Beloved. So all these connections just make my mind pop. Maybe not everyone, they think, look, listening to Jumana and I thinking these are such nerds, but these things make my mind pop because you cannot stop the transnational. You cannot stop what Jumana said, that transnational love and connection that we have. And it's here. And I know that it is overlooked internationally, but we are trying to unearth that because we have something to be proud about.
Absolutely. Before I go to you, Jumana, I mean, it looks like the activism in previous generations didn't really differ much from the way we are dealing with repression, for example. Did you see any difference of how previous generations were reacting? Like you mentioned the Eddie Zenaniri's picture. Like, how did they deal with these kind of gagging of the Palestinian narrative back then that is different from now?
Yeah. So I have it's basically in the way that you do your activism has changed. So I have whole folders that were donated to me, which shows the work that was done to push back against visa cancellations, the pressure to deny visas, the pressure to shut down 3CR community radio. So all these mini little campaigns that are very similar to what we see now, to repress any sort of Palestinian advocacy, and to push back against that anti-Palestinian racism. So the resources available then was, letters to the editor, was opinion pieces in newspapers, writing to politicians. So they have a whole folder of, faxes that were sent out, identical faxes sent out to politicians. Recently, a collection of books by Palestinians and about Palestine were sent out to politicians. So I think it's really interesting to see that, you work with the media available to you and the resources available to you at the time. But, it's just different forms of communication. But it is always about countering, pushing back, making the case. And always the same story is we are so much more under-resourced than than the Zionist lobby. And that's another story in and of itself, how a lot of this work is done by people in their homes, under incredible pressure. What we're seeing now is a lot more, our movement has grown, but there were certainly, very familiar faces doing the heavy lifting then, and then looking at how the movement opened up.
I've been reading Ilan Pappé's new book, Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic. And I mean, the lobbying for Zionism started in a similar way, like inside houses, like simple people. Of course, they had devious intentions for the future, but it's just Zionism is so entrenched and so old and aged in our politics and economics in general. So, Jumana, I mean, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what is exactly that you found out about your work at the moment in terms of the archive. Is there any interesting stories that you've caught your attention?
I haven't zeroed in on any particular stories, although there are plenty, but it's fortuitous that Randa sort of finished on talking about the different technologies that we use, whether it's a fax machine or WhatsApp messages. Because if I'm going through the files, I'm seeing old-fashioned fax paper, facsimile paper that's worn out. or you know, how the writing on it fades. I'm seeing the use of you know, messaging, like, you know, there's no text messaging technology, so you know, WhatsApp or whatever, so they're using email in a way that we might today just text each other, you know, for short responses and things like that. I'm seeing a lot of handwritten journaling of you know, meetings and those kinds of things. I'm seeing interviews conducted with artists, again over email, and I would still use that mode because I'm of a particular age, but I don't know how many people would still use those kinds of, I certainly wouldn't use a fax machine because nobody has a fax machine. But what that reminds me of, because our work is crossing the cultural and the political here, is, you know, when it feels like such a lifetime ago now, but when the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring started, everything was about Facebook and the Facebook uprising or the Twitter, whatever. It was like, you know, all we heard was the West gave you this technology and now you're using it to liberate yourself. It's not the first time we've come across this kind of business of the use of technology in political contexts. So, you know, Napoleon took the printing press with him to Egypt and he civilized Egypt. There were fax machines being used in the 1990s. There were tape recordings in the 1970s and 60s when, you know, Khomeini was in exile from Iran. And those messages were being distributed over, you know, tapes, what we call tape cassettes. That's the word I'm looking for. So that's kind of, those are kinds of the things I've been thinking about as I've been looking at these older forms of technology, or maybe, you know, stuff that's no longer usable. I mean, the tricky thing is you get things on VHS tape, and then you've got to go find the player, which doesn't exist anymore because nobody's kept one. Or even like, you know, CDs are difficult to play as well.
I just digitized a whole stack of VHS. Yeah. Can I just quickly interrupt because you remind me of something. Do you remember in the focus group? So the technologies have changed, of course, but the technologies are being spied upon as well. So now they tap our phones, but we spoke to people whose houses were tapped. And so they would find little things in there underneath their coffee tables. So they were telling us bugs put in their cars and their coffee tables. So that's really interesting as well to see how, you know, the surveillance has changed as well. Obviously.
We've got Pegasus now. I mean, which is...
So in terms of like, I discovered like we already mentioned theatre, but there are other collectives that were formed. So SAFA, which is Sydney Arab Feminist Alliance, that's another sort of discovery I made as I was going through the materials. And there are others that I haven't necessarily noted down. The advocacy for, in particular, Palestine and Lebanon, but also Iraq, like Iraq in the early 90s and then Iraq again in 2003. That's been a big theme that I've extracted from the work that I've been looking at, that Alice has been working through with me. But I guess the most important discovery I've made, or I feel that I've made, and it's of the most interest to me, is the leadership that you see from women. And I think I already alluded to this. It was almost instantly clear to me that women had taken the charge from the start of doing not just, you know, cultural production, but cultural work that was politically invested and engaged, and taking that out beyond, you know, just their own little circle. So the political work that they were doing was being developed through their artistic practice. And again, I really want to stress this. It wasn't a case of real political work is going on over here and we're just doing some artwork that might be related to politics by sheer coincidence. It's not that at all. That's where the political work was taking place, from what I can tell, and for our community at least. And then there were many things going on. There were different pockets and different energies taking place, but this was also a prime site to be aware of. And Randa and I have been working most closely with three women, Paula Raboud, Alissa Chidiak, and Alissa Gazelle. There were other women involved, but I think these are the main three that we're familiar with as well. And I guess for me, what makes these discoveries so energizing, if I could use that word, for my research, is the unique dimension that it gives when talking about the Australian context of the Arab diaspora. Now, I've mentioned earlier that there was this massive body of material that I found. I didn't even need to find it, it's there. It's in America, a lot of it's digitized, a lot of it isn't, so I have to go there and look at it. When you look there in the early years, it was men that led the charge. Now, obviously, we're talking about different eras. I'm talking like early 1900s versus like 1970s, 80s here, which is the period I sort of start with. So that might have an impact. But it doesn't detract from the fact that it was men that started it over there and it took on a particular shape and color, and it was women that started it here and it took on a particular shape and color. And I guess a consequence for me of Arab women in Australia being so prominent is that it shaped in many ways the practice, the how of the doing of the cultural work, which I already mentioned was intensely collaborative, and all of those other things that I mentioned, and the way of the collaboration. So I think that that's a unique story in terms of a big picture story. That's a unique story to tell, and one that I've been keen on working out a way to tell it based on the materials that I've been looking at, and why it's so important to keep that in focus.
Jumana, as far as the art cultural activism in previous generations, what was the community engagement back then? How was it different from today's engagement? Like, are people were people encouraging such activism? I mean, now I kind of hardly see that kind of encouragement. Maybe I'm just in a different box outside this realm, but like, what kind of engagement difference?
It's a good question. I don't really know how to answer it. If in terms of engagement, I mean, if you're talking about, did people view the exhibitions? Was there an audience? There were always audiences, and there were always, there was popular sort of movement around. I mean, they were popular in what kind of small theatre can be by that measure. I think I could be wrong. I'm not in the field. I think there might be now, maybe Randa can attest to this or not, there might be now more opportunities to find funding for these things, or there might not be, I'm not quite sure. But it appears to me that the people working then managed to do a lot on very little, and managed to find pockets as much as possible, pockets where they could work that in spaces that were safe. And if the spaces weren't safe for, being an Arab woman interested in advocating for Palestine, or needing to advocate for Palestine or Lebanon or whatever, you made your own space. And that might have had an impact or shaped the level of engagement as well. But I can't answer your question perfectly, because I actually haven't even thought about it. You've caught me off guard there.
That's actually what I meant. Like, engagement from the community could also be, for example, funding or sponsoring these kind of activist work. Did you have anything to add to this, Randa?
I mean, I'm not sure how we would measure like how the effective engagement is, but certainly like the sort of the work that we're tracing, like in the cultural space, definitely there were audiences, and there was, when you speak to these activists, they all, one of the things that they constantly said was that they were filling gaps, that people were badly, in need of this, there was definitely a demand for these sorts of spaces, a need for it. In terms of funding, I'm not sure. We'd need to dig deeper into that. But I know that from my own experiences, for example, way back in 1996, when I was still, no, in 1998, sorry, I was a law student at Melbourne University, and I was offered a role as Australia's very first media liaison officer, which was out of the Islamic Council of Victoria. And that, I still remember the launch of that. It was like a huge community event, and there was so much, enthusiasm and encouragement for the idea, and people funding it, seeing a need for it. I think, along the way, there has always been that sort of engagement with the community in feeling that we need these sorts of roles and interventions. And that, I would say that there has been a lot of uptake from community.
I have got so many questions to ask as a follow-up on this, but I think for the sake of time, we're going to have to move on. I want to go to both of you as well for this question. I mean, how have you two divided your approach to collecting materials for the archive? Start with Jumana this time, maybe.
So the way we narrated the separation of the labor, so to speak, was that I was going to focus on the cultural stuff and Randa was going to focus on the political work. It's inseparable, and we kind of knew that from the beginning. We've tried to kind of make, I'm speaking from my impressions of this, Randa might contradict what I'm about to say. I think we've tried to maintain those lines, but we know like they're intensely blurred. In terms of sort of the more mechanical stuff, I've dealt more with the work from Alisar Chiriak, Randa's, I think you went and saw Ali Kaza and things like that. We did go together to Melbourne to meet with someone there, and we had a meeting with them, and he's got a body of material as well. So that's kind of been, like, Randa's not, we're not trained historians. We don't have like, a background in knowing what it means to necessarily build an archive as trained historians. So there's a lot of working it out, I guess, along the way. I often sometimes talk to my historian friend, Dr. Anne Mansour, and she sometimes gives me some guidance on how to go with what we're doing.
What about you, Randa? How did you?
So the timing of all of this project is really important. Jumana did start before me. I started in 2022, and I had, reached out to activists, and, boxes of material, archival material were donated to me, photographs and newspapers, and, I've kept all of that and digitized a lot of VHS tapes, and which has been incredible. But for Jumana and I, October happened, and this has really impacted everything for us. Not just in terms of thinking about why we're doing this, but also the sense that everybody is under, in a state of fighting genocide. It's in a state of emergency. And so sometimes the priorities, are changing, and the sense that you're imposing is, and that everyone is dealing with so much grief. It's very difficult to meet people and say, come on, let's talk about history when we're living in this moment. That's something that, the effective impact of a genocide on our work is something we can't discount. And it impacts also on how we're able to access our communities who are all in a state of crisis. So I had these big plans of interviewing people who organize protests and, collecting placards. And now, every week there's a protest somewhere. It's made the data sample so much bigger. Actually, it's actually given us a little bit of discipline to say, well, maybe we're looking pre-October rather than this moment in itself. But yeah.
Absolutely. It's such an important work because there must be a lot of learnings that we can use actually in our current activism after October the 7th. I mean, Randa, how do you see this project helping empower students in their engagement in advocacy and solidarity around issues such as human rights, freedom of speech at the moment? How do you see that bulk of work will help us now in our activism?
Well, I've had a few research assistants who, have come back to me after they've done their, specific task and say, oh, can I use a few of the you know, pictures from the Free Palestine newspaper in one of my essays, for example. So it's actually opened their eyes to this whole history that they had never known about or had little access to. So like in that sense, it's like a pedagogical space for students. And I think that, you know, in terms of making this accessible, there's so much people can learn from. Lateral violence has always been there, for example, you know, the way that we deal with conflict resolution. There's a lot we can learn and a lot we can unlearn. So yeah, I think that there's going to be an enormous resource there for this generation to look at, you know, lessons from the past.
Absolutely. Jumana, what do you think, or what do you hope this archive will achieve for future generations of Arab Australians?
So, I mean, as Randa suggested, it's a repository of information, of material. I guess for me, I want the story that women were central in so many ways to become obvious to researchers as they start to look through the material. That might be a bit too, what's the word? I'm curating the archive before I've even created it. So I might have to step back from that idea and they can discover it themselves. But that's something that's really been important to me. The other thing I really want to see come from this is for our community, in whatever that might mean in the broadest sense of the term, that they have a past here and they have a deeper past than what we've assumed and what we've been told over the years. It's not a past that's just simply, oh, you know, we're a bunch of migrants, our parents or our grandparents came here, and, you know, many of us succeeded, some of us didn't, and that's kind of the end of the story. It's more than that. I think, this is where I'm coming at it from, that we're a community, one of the many kind of communities in this multicultural country, who have helped give Australia a kind of international face, interconnected Australia, I guess, to the rest of the world. Now, Australia might not like that. Mainstream Australia might not like that because the connection that we're giving is not one that they like. But we have done that. So why would I care about this? My research is in diaspora studies. I work on the Arab diaspora and the literature that Arab authors write. And what the cultural practitioners have helped me, and what I'm saying by cultural practitioners, I mean the people here, have helped me flesh out, is a kind of another dimension of this idea of diaspora. I've always been fascinated by the migrant world that I've grown up in. So my family, you know, my father was a migrant to Australia and all of my uncles were, and my aunts. And so that world has always fascinated me, and I've turned it into sort of my object of study. And I've often thought, from a very young age, although it took 3 academics to articulate it in one of their articles, that this is what they said. Their wording is, the Middle East exists in the world and the world exists in the Middle East. And I've always felt that, and I've always thought that, although I've never sort of said it in that way. Today, I think it's even more specific to say, and relevant to say, that, well, at least for me, Lebanon and Palestine exist in the world and the world exists in those spaces. And these examples of art, cultural performance or whatever from these people working in the cultural arts space, they were part of doing that from, you know, a few decades ago, internationalizing what it means to be an Arab here and kind of bringing that world into this space, into this, and doing it in a way that's true to their diaspora identity or true to their transnational kind of identity. So those are the things that I hope future generations will see in our work, and to kind of understand that the places that, you know, if it's an Arab person looking at the material, the place, you know, their heritage, their history isn't something that just exists over there. It actually was formed also here. And for those that are not Arab and might be looking at this material, I kind of also want them to understand that our community is is here and did have some does have another story to tell, a different one to what, you know, the mainstream story about us often is, particularly post, I guess, the post 9/11 era and so on.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just, as Jumana was talking, you know, you put the case so beautifully about why, like looking inward as to why this archive is necessary for our own self-narration and understanding of where we've come from. That leans into now, because of what's happening in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, you know, real-time genocide. You know, we're constantly also thinking about how this archive, I feel, in this moment teaches us about, well, what is our vision? What are we imagining going forward? The decolonial, how can we imagine that? The politics of solidarity. There's a lot to learn, again, about how that solidarity work was done. But also, as an archive of accountability, I think that this also can contribute to that larger archive of accountability, where we are tracing the people who betrayed us, who didn't listen to us, who evidence has been there from the get-go, and it's been documented, and we've been saying the same thing for decades now. And we're not going to let them off the hook either. So as you know, as simple as the case of the Labor Party, you know, we're constantly saying we're going to punish to the Labor Party, but there's decades of punishment that has not happened. We haven't exacted our punishment. And again, you know, it's very easy for every politician to come in and act like they've started something fresh and new, but they're building on a legacy of betrayal. I think it's really important as part of the wider archive of accountability to provide that next generation with that longer, you know, that longer history of accountability as well.
It sounds like there's a lot to learn out of this project and out of this archive. I mean, how do you expect the audience, for example, to engage and support and, you know, see the work that you use? I mean, are you helping to use some sort of social media to bring all that details to public? And that will be my last question, I promise.
Well, Jumana's working a lot on sort of the mechanics of how we're going to put this together as a digital archive, and we're going to be seeing the most accessible way. That for us, that is at the forefront of our mind, is to make this accessible. It's not just something for academics. We want this to be, you know, for community. So the exact details of how that's going to happen, we still need to work on, because things change so quickly as our technology changes. The priority now is to build the actual data, the collection, and then see what is the most accessible way to make that, and then launch in ways that make it part of the community.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, don't be fooled by what Randa said. I'm working on the mechanics. I am a Luddite. I'm not very good at technology, but I'm trying to find ways. I'm thinking that, you know, bringing it to the public in stages and in waves might be more doable for us. Starting in more simple formats, and, you know, maybe if some one wants to fund this and give us some money, we could make it really, really shine as a digital archive, and maybe as a physical, you know, put it somewhere physically as well, if there's any paper material that we want to store. So that's, I think in stages might be the best way to go, and work out how we can best do that, and keep on expanding it, because we don't want it to just be a static thing. People will come forward with material, I think, that we can keep adding to it.
Well, really all the best with that, and I really hope you achieve your goals out of that. I'm really delighted to have been in conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks to Randa, and thanks, Jumana.
Thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you.
Thank you.